Welcome, listener, to Snippit Sports Science. I'm Jared Coleman-Stark, today joined by Chris Gaviglio. How you doing?
Very well, Jared, and it's great to have you back on board, back on the podcast.
Yeah, long hiatus there, but the thesis is tucked away pretty well, and I think things are rolling along and should be back to regular podcasting.
Now we're going to get straight on to the article today, and do you want to just give a bit of an explanation on how the next few articles are going to run?
I've looked at a lot of heated resistance training articles as part of my thesis, and so we're going to be going over a lot of the heated articles that I've included in the literature review in my thesis. And so the first article today is called The Effects of Heat Adaptation on Physiology, Perception, and Exercise Performance in the Heat, a Meta-Analysis. Now, admittedly, most heat adaptation literature is on aerobic exercise rather than resistance training, but because there's so much more background in that area, we've decided that we'll provide this as a bit of context, moving into more articles on the heated resistance training to give us a bit of context and background.
Yeah, exactly. And after reading this article, it was a really good background analysis of all the literature that's out there. And it's a really good starting point. And just for myself, because obviously you're living and breathing this, Jared, that you're very comfortable in this space. So for me, it was that really good starting point.
Just to give a bit of context around heat, obviously performance is typically impaired in the heat, resulting in premature fatigue for the athletes. A lot of countermeasures have been developed to try and compensate for these performance decrements, such as fluid replacement, cooling intervention before or during the as well as heat adaptation, particularly because hydration strategies and cooling may be effective acute interventions. So for a single session, they don't have that longitudinal, long-term, chronic sort of benefit that heat adaptation would have. And some researchers have declared that heat adaptation is the most important intervention one can adopt to reduce physiological strain and optimize performance. Probably the biggest consideration when we're exploring heat adaptation is the length of that heat adaptation. And so the researchers here have split it into 3 different categories where they have short-term heat adaptation, mid-term, and long-term. And they're separating that by essentially the number of weeks that the athlete has undergone that heat adaptation. So short adaptation is 1 week or less, medium is between 1 to 2 weeks, and long-term is greater than 2 adaptation.
And from my understanding, there's actually not a lot of long-term heat adaptation papers out there at the moment.
No, not a lot. In most of the outcome measures that they're looking at, there will only be 1 or 2 long-term heat adaptation protocols, which is understandable because taking 2 weeks for a study, or greater than 2 weeks for a heat adaptation, is a big chunk out of the athlete's time. And a lot of athletes have very strong time constraints, particularly for when they would want to be applying heat adaptation prior to a competition. And so it's just not possible to be applying those protocols. Although doing the long-term heat adaptation studies are very beneficial because you can do a mid-adaptation measure. And so you effectively get 2 studies in one, that you can do a short or mid-term intervention measure and then a longer-term measure a week later.
With respect to this actual meta-analysis, what their goal was to actually systematically review all the different heat adaptation literature and quantify these effects that heat adaptation has on physiological and perceptual responses to heat exposure, and therefore the subsequent exercise capacity in hot environment. It's actually split into 2 parts. And the first section reviews all the literature, and it's fantastic. It really goes through the stats and goes into great detail into it. But we're actually going to start to focus a little bit more on the second section, which really brings these results into context and brings more of a practical application, which I think from a coach's point of view that perhaps has great application to what we're trying to do with this podcast. And once again, we always advocate that if you really want to get deep dive into the stats and the results, is just to grab the paper. This is a paper. Really thorough.
Right. It's really impressive, comprehensive tables and figures. In this, I think there are 3 or 4 pages of tables, details of every single study that they've reviewed, meta-analysis. As the audience can probably tell from the title of the podcast, this is going to be a 2-part episode, as we usually do with meta-analyses, because it's just such a large paper. We're going to break that in.
That's right. There's probably 2 concepts that I think is useful for us to explain in a little bit of detail before we actually get into the actual different components of how heat adaptation can help performance in the different physiological responses. The first one is human adaptation to heat, and this really revolves around just how the body responds to heat. And in respect to this actual concept here, it talks about how thermal adaptation requires a series of sufficiently overload thermal impulses, or in other words, changes in body temperature over time, which exceed an adaptation threshold and facilitates those adaptations and growth within the accommodation reserve range. Just like strength training, we need to stress the body in a certain way for it to respond. Similar to this whole concept of heat adaptation, we need to be able to give it, in this case here, overload of thermal impulses, so that change in body temperature. And once again, if the impulse is insufficient, adaptation won't occur. There's two main forms of heat adaptation, and the firstly, they're known as heat acclimation, which refers to artificially induced heat adaptation, such as using a laboratory-based environmental chamber, like a lot of Jared's experiments, and also heat acclimatization, which refers to adaptations which recur as a result of natural exposures, such as warm weather training camps or domestic exposures to elevated ambient temperatures. You hear a lot of people, especially in European countries, will go to more countries to actually get that heat acclimatization before a competition. While changes in body temperature probably received the most attention in the heat adaptation literature, the author Taylor highlighted how integrated the physiological responses to heat exposure are. For example, a reduced body temperature during rest and exercise is a key variable associated with successful heat adaptation, but reductions in mean body temperature requires alteration in water loss, sweat rate, and or skin blood flow responses. And also, these alterations would not be possible if not for the involvement of the kidneys and sweat glands operating under control of the medulla oblongata and hypothalamus respectively. As we can see here, that it's just not one thing at play, which we probably alluded to in a lot of things. And sometimes things are a marker and not necessarily a direct causal factor of something that may occur. Another author, Sorka, suggested the four classic markers of heat acclimation were a lower heart rate, a lower core body temperature, a higher sweat rate, and an improved exercise performance in hot conditions. Going on further, as we would expect, exercise in heat places the body under greater physiological strain than exercise at the same intensity in conditions. And this is one of the main conditions that we've got to obviously consider when we're trying to implement this for the athletes that we train. An increase in thermoregulatory strain has been shown to have many detrimental effects on the body, such as decreasing volitional muscle recruitment, increasing body fluid loss, increasing feelings of discomfort, and disturbing the linear relationship in heart rate and oxygen consumption observed in temperature conditions. So there's lots of things here at play that we've got to consider. So it's not something that we necessarily say, right, heat's good for us, but we've got to take these things into consideration before we actually implement it to our athlete.
Going into the different methods of heat adaptation, the effectiveness of any heat adaptation regimen appears dependent upon the magnitude and rate of physiological change. It makes sense that as adaptation occurs, the magnitude of physiological strain will reduce because the athlete adapted to the heat stress. Therefore, it's important to optimize the adaptation by presenting the athlete with a constant thermal impulse so that as adaptation occurs, a physiological overload continues to be presented. This heat adaptation approach can be active or passive and is often called controlled hypothermia, or the isothermal model. It's one of the three main heat adaptation types, the other two types being controlled work rate and self-regulated method. The controlled work rate model is probably the most commonly used method, especially in military settings, because of its ease of use for acclimatizing multiple individuals simultaneously. It's been suggested that due to difficulties in quantifying the thermal strain and ensuring a progressive overload, the controlled work rate and the self-regulated methods may be inferior to the controlled hypothermia model. The response to different heat adaptation protocols can be influenced by the method and number of heat exposures. Going back to the four classic markers of heat acclimation that Sorka developed and Chris mentioned previously, the lower heart rate, lower core temperature, higher sweat rate, and an improved exercise performance in hot conditions, this usually requires 10 to 14 heat exposures. However, other researchers, such as Windham and colleagues, have reported that although complete heart rate and core temperature reductions occurred within 14 exposures, sweat rate changes did not. Adaptation appears to occur more rapidly in the first week of heat adaptation compared to the second. So, although we can get a lot of the benefits just from 1 week of heat adaptation, if you want the full benefits, you'll probably have to do more than just a week. You'll need to do 2 weeks, or perhaps it says later in the article, up to an entire month for those maximum optimum benefits. However, as few as 4 heat exposures in trained athletes have observed benefits.
I quite like the next bit here, where it actually says that heat acclimation protocols can be categorized in 3 time frames, which is very similar to what Joe said before. Short term, less than 7 exposures, medium term, 8 to 14 exposures, and long term, greater than 15 exposures. And really, when you think about these short-term approaches are attractive to time-short individuals and teams, which typically that's what happens. Teams go on to pre-season camps, or athletes are approaching a major competition, and they have this real short-term type high-frequency exposure to heat adaptations to get those responses for training in an upcoming competition. Perhaps another point here is that while the number of heat exposures is important, the extent of the adaptation is also dependent on the intensity and the duration of the heat exposure, which is very similar to a lot of the things we talk about in all the type of papers, is that it's not only the extent, but it's that intensity duration. Really, it's just the stress and how we expose the athletes to the stress.
Right, and previously it's been suggested that successful heat adaptation requires a minimum daily heat exposure of 2 hours, but more recently, it's been suggested that a minimum of 1 hour a day is required. So probably that absolute minimum heat adaptation you can get away with, that you're getting decent benefits if you're under a serious time crunch, is 1 hour a day for 4 days.
I think that's a little bit more really, the 1 hour a day than 2, just quietly.
Well, I could see 2 daily sauna sessions of 1 hour. So I wouldn't want to sit in a sauna for 2 hours straight. But, an hour at the beginning of the day and an hour at the end of the day, that's quite nice. I've done a similar protocol to that recently when I lived right next to a heat sauna as part of the complex I was living in. And it was really enjoyable to get an hour of heat in the morning and an hour of heat in the evening when I got back from work.
Now we're going to actually start to get into the meta-analysis. And as I alluded to earlier, there was really 2 sections of it. And the first one was a real thorough and complete review of all the different heat adaptation studies. And we're not going to really go into that, but rather go into what they call as the secondary aim, which was an attempt to establish the optimal heat adaptation regimen and offer practical recommendations for this type of delivery. We'll also go through the results, but it's packaged a little bit better. And what we're going to just talk about now is just how they put the meta-analysis together, because I think it's quite interesting and quite thorough. For example, when they started off, they said that the initial search was conducted in June 2014 and the final search was performed on 16th of February 2016. So almost 2 years they've actually been searching for articles. So it's quite a thorough collection period.
Yeah, it's a very comprehensive meta-analysis. I think they ended up with 96 studies in the end and about over 1,000 total.
Another thing that I read into here was when they did their data analysis, they actually did a lot of work where they converted, for example, when the standard error data was reported, they converted these to standard deviation. And they really made an effort to try and get a homogeneous type data set so they can actually start to compare studies to studies. They used confidence intervals, Cohen's classification of effect size magnitude. They used that in there as well as Spearman's correlation analysis to try and find the relationships between all the different variables.
Just looking at their summary of participants in heat adaptation regimens now, they had a total of 96 manuscripts, 30 of which were looking at short-term heat adaptation. The majority, 61 of them, were looking at midterm, and only 9 were looking at adaptations. So, like we were saying previously, there's not as many long-term heat adaptation studies.
That's right. And when you actually look at Table 1, they summarize all the different groups. For example, when you look at the number of sessions in the short-term heat acclimation, there was 6 there, medium 10, and the long-term 70 of sessions. They spoke about the days between. There was 0, so it was obviously protocol. The duration of the sessions varied anywhere between 78 minutes to around 119 minutes. And then the temperature, which seemed to be around that 40-degree mark, although there was some fluctuation as low as 28 and as high as 55 degrees. It gave a really good spread of type of sessions that the athletes were actually exposed to.
One thing I thought was pretty interesting in there was that although, of course, there are more heat exposures for the midterm and long term, the total heat that was experienced sometimes in the short term could, or at least the midterm, would be greater than that of the long term because the actual duration within the short or the midterm was greater. So for example, in the midterm, they were in those heat sessions for about 120 minutes at a time, 2 hours, whereas in the long term, they were in there for about 100 minutes. And so some of the shorter duration heat adaptation actually experienced a greater total heat exposure. The other part that I thought was quite interesting was a little the consistency between the different studies. Like you're saying, 0 days between heat adaptation sessions. Almost entirely all of the studies were consecutive heat training days, or heat adaptation days rather. So they would be going in every single day. They wouldn't have any breaks or quote unquote recovery between those heat adaptation days, as well as very consistently using a 40 degrees Celsius temperature and about 40% relative humidity in almost all the sessions. Just getting ready for part 2, we'll give you a bit of an overview of what we'll be discussing in 2 weeks' time. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast so you can get a notification when part 2. We'll be talking about the ergogenic effect of heat adaptation and the effect of heat adaptation on lots of different physiological variables such as skin blood flow, skeletal muscle metabolism, heat shock protein expression, as perceptual measures such as rating of perceived exertion.
But also along with that, what we're going to be going into is those practical applications, which I think are quite important, and the mechanisms behind it, because we want to try and understand a little bit more as to what's happening. And just because something may not have a significant effect, that's okay, but there may be actually a positive subjective type response, which actually may lead to better training responses and so forth. But I really think it brings it together quite nicely with those practical applications. That's where we'll leave it today. Join us in 2 weeks' time where we're going to really bring this together nicely. So thanks, Jared, for joining us on today's podcast.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, listeners. Please visit our sponsor at eliteform.com, and remember to subscribe to the podcast so we get part 2.